Diolch yn fawr iawn i chi am ymuno gyda ni heddi ar gyfer ein gwem yna i baratoi i ddarparu'r gymhwyster dilyniant mewn gwaith tir. Thank you very much for joining us on how to deliver the progression qualification in groundworks. Dyma'r webinar olaf ar y masnad maesau unigol ar gyfer y cymhwyster dilyniant. Gallwch weld bob recordiad ar wefan Sgiliau i Gymru. This is the last in a series of webinars on the individual trade-specific areas. You can view all the recordings on the Skills for Wales website. Dyma beth fyddwn ni'n mynd trwyddo yn y webinar yma. Fe fyddwn yn esbonio pam mae gennym ni y gymhwysterau newydd yma, ac yna yn edrych ar gynnwys y gymhwyster dilyniant, gan edrych ar gwaith tir yn benodol. Fe fyddwn yn edrych ar strwythur yr unedau ac yn rhoi amlinelliad o'r asesiadau. Yna, fe fyddwn yn edrych ar yr adnoddau a fydd ar gael i chi, cyn symud ymlaen at y camau nesaf. Fyddwn yn mynd trwyddo'r trefniadau trosiannol gyda chi, ac i gloi, fe fyddwn yn rhoi y cyfle i chi ofyn unrhyw cwestiynau. Plis rhowch eich cwestiynau yn y tab cwestiynau sydd ar y llaw dde o'ch sgrin. This is what we'll be discussing in this webinar. We will be briefly going over the transformation of these new qualifications. We will look at the progression qualification content, looking specifically on groundworks. We will look at the structure of the units and outline of the assessments. We will then have a look at the resources available for you before moving on to the next steps. We will then go over the transition arrangements that are in place. And to close the webinar, we will be giving you an opportunity to ask us any questions. Therefore, please type any questions that you have throughout this webinar in the Questions tab on the right-hand side of your screen. The presentation will last about an hour, with half an hour for questions. Fe fydd y cyflwyniad yn para tua awr, gyda hanner awr i gwestiynau. Felly dyma i chi eich cyflwynwyr heddi. Here are your presenters today. We have David Pye, who's the Technical Advisor for Building Services at City and Guilds. We also have Ian Roberts, who's the Technical Advisor for Construction at City and Guilds, and also myself, Angharad Lloyd-Bainan, who's the Business Manager for City and Guilds for Wales. Nawr, fe gewn ni Paul sydyn i wybod am eich dealltwriaeth chi am y cymhwyster newydd yma. Now, we will have a quick poll to get your understanding of the new qualification. Os gallwch chi roi eich dealltwriaeth gyda 5 y rif uchaf, please give your level of understanding with 5 being the highest. Felly sut byddwch yn disgrifio eich dealltwriaeth o'r gymhwyster dilyniant? So please rate your understanding of the progression qualification with 5 being the highest level of understanding. Gan i roi ychydig o eiliadau i roi cyfle i chi ateb. Just give you a few more moments to give you a chance to answer. Diolch yn fawr i chi. Thank you very much. Ewn ni nawr droso pam mae'r cymhwysterau newydd yma wedi dod. We will now go over why these new qualifications have come into Wales. Therefore, in February 2018, Qualifications Wales published the Building the Future report, which was a sector review of qualifications and the qualification system in construction and the built environment in Wales. The report summarised the views of learning providers and a range of professional and representative bodies, together with more than 100 employers and over 900 learners. It included findings from our own review of a sample of qualifications on an international comparison study. Qualifications Wales' outline findings were that there were inconsistent assessment practice. Assessment is often not well managed and quality assurance can be inconsistent, with some areas of learning not effectively assessed. They found that there was also a need for learners to be able to deal with a range of tasks and to be able to problem solve, which we have incorporated into the new qualifications, with aspects such as planning and evaluation skills. There was a need that qualifications needed to meet the skills needs of Wales, such as heritage buildings, traditional materials, tools and techniques, and how they have changed over time. They found that there was a need to rationalise the amount of 400 plus technical and vocational qualifications in the construction and built environment sector, and the need for having coherence in these qualifications. We also found the need to keep portability between the nations. So the consortium of EL and City and Guilds have been working with sector bodies to facilitate this and using recognised standards for each trade. Felly ni wedi gwneud y cymwysterau yna, ni wedi cynnwys wedi cael ei datblygu ar y cyd gyda nifer o randdeilliant. The content has been developed in conjunction with a number of stakeholders, such as technical consultants from across Wales, technical working groups and forums, such as various focus groups, stakeholder focus forums and BACH. We've also been working with current practitioners across Wales, and also industry, including micro, small, medium and large contractors across the sector. And all this has been done with the agreement with Qualifications Wales. On this slide, there's just a questions page for you, just for you to be able to refer back to. And at the end of this webinar, you will be receiving a copy of this presentation. There's just some questions that you may have and be able to refer back to. This slide shows you the progression qualification, the various options for learners. So option A would be that the learner would complete 1 year in full-time learning before securing an apprenticeship. Option B would be that the learner completes 2 years in full-time learning before securing an apprenticeship. And option C would be the learner would have direct entry to an apprenticeship from September 2022. So the foundation qualification is the entry point for learners who wish to start their journey towards occupational competence in a construction or building services engineering trade. The progression qualification has been designed as an optional second year for learners to do after the foundation. It is particularly useful as a meaningful programme of study in full-time education if a learner has not secured an apprenticeship place. Felly hoffwn nawr eich trosglwyddo I David Pye a fydd yn eich tywysg trwy y sleidiau nesaf. I would now like to pass you over to David Pye, who will take you through the next few slides. Diolch, David. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ann-Harad, and welcome everyone. We're now just going to move on to some of the content. Just a reminder that you have a questions tab on your panel, so please click on that and type in any queries you might have as we're going through the presentation. So first of all, we'd like to introduce you to the joint branded documents relating to the progression qualification. The qualification handbook is a starting point and contains information on staffing, resources, summary of assessment and qualification content. You will also have an assessment pack and project pack which gives in-depth information on the assessment requirements, such as centre practicals, resource lists, how to conduct centre assessments. They will also be available in the Welsh language and will be available shortly on the consortium website. So now let's move on to the next slide and consider those important rules of combination. There are 3 core units which are 201, employment and employability in the construction sector. And this covers things such as relevant bodies, self-employment, personal skills and problem solving. Then we have unit 202, which is changing practices over time. And this unit will cover things such as the changing environment, construction materials, tools and techniques, the relationship between trades and the environment, and connected practice between construction and building services engineering. And then unit 203, planning and evaluating work within construction in Wales. This unit will typically cover cost calculation, resource requirements, planning of work, and the importance of evaluating work. So those are the core units. Let's move on and look at the trade-specific units. So you can see the 3 core units, and in Pathway H, groundworks, we've also got the core knowledge, setting out, installation of drainage, and preparing and mixing construction-related materials. The GLH for this qualification is 540, and this is the time the average learner is anticipated to study and be assessed under supervision. This is broken down to 100 hours for the core, 378 for the pathway, and 62 for assessment. Total qualification time also factors in additional time a learner will spend on their own study, such as research and revision. So the qualification has a TQT of 600 hours. So thank you, and now I'd like to pass you back to my colleague Ian to take you through the next section. Thank you, Ian.
Thank you, David and Harrod, and welcome, ladies and gentlemen. I'd now like to take a closer look into the units and the structure of the units as we move forward. There is always a temptation to look at assessments and work backwards to delivery. But if we consider the qualification handbook and the details in the units, we will get a full outlook of the content to be delivered. Just a gentle reminder that the learning outcome is the overview. The assessment criteria starts to detail what outcome is expected for successful assessment, and the range indicates the breadth of knowledge and skills to be covered. All elements of the range must be covered in the delivery. Here you can see that we've highlighted is Unit 202 that was mentioned by David previously, and the title is Changing Practices Over Time. At the top of the page, whichever unit there will be, will show the unit number and the title. In this instance, the guided learning hours is 45. It then goes on to describe a brief overview of the unit. And in this instance, it is for learners to gain knowledge and understanding about materials, tools, and techniques have changed and adapted from 1919, as well as looking to the future. This is something tutors delivering this content may have to carry out additional research or CPD to update their knowledge and understanding. However, this is no different to what we've had to carry out previously when we had to teach new content. Immediately below, you will see the learning outcomes, and in this instance, it's learning outcome 1. And this is just a reminder that what you'll see moving on in further slides is that learning outcome 1, 2, and 3 have all got the same titles, whichever pathway you will be delivering. This will then, of course, will be contextualized to each trade area or pathway. One key difference compared to current qualifications is that we're going to, or I should say that we intend not to use active verbs such as state, explain, and describe in the criteria. This was to enable the content to be assessed in various different ways. But the depth of content section, which you will see and it's shown in blue, will give you a good description as to what depth the content needs to be taught. Following on, we can see the learning outcome discussed on the earlier slide and learning outcome 2 from Unit 202 with the title, Know the Changes in Construction Methods Over Time. When we look at criteria 2.1, we can see the heading pre-1919 construction methods, and the range is immediately beneath. When we build up to 2.3, 21st century construction techniques and technologies, we could then ask, what does this cover? And this is where we consider the range off-site manufacturing, prefabricated construction components, 3D printing of construction components, and then we can ask to what depth. And the depth in the lower blue box describes further the expected outcomes. So let's have a closer look at 2.3, which states learners will know emerging methods of construction for 21st century buildings. This should include the materials, tools and techniques relevant to their chosen trade, etc. And the depth of content is there to provide you with the information you will require to the depth of coverage that is required. To help reinforce the message from the previous slide and to show our pathway in groundworks, we will take a close look at Unit 233, which is installed drainage. Once again, you can see the title and the guided learning hours, which is 120, and then a brief description of the unit content. At the bottom of the slide, as I've mentioned previously, now we can see the three outcomes: learning outcome 1, 2, and 3. And these are standard learning outcomes titles for all the pathways and decontextualized for each unit. We have the same layout and structure with plenty of information to guide the depth of delivery. Following on from the previous slide, now we can see the same layout. We have learning outcome 3 from Unit 236 and the depth of content that has to be covered. Criteria 3.1, we can see the criteria and the range, and it states lay bedding materials, install and test pipework, etc. And the materials could be clay, concrete, metal or plastic, etc. And then the range is immediately beneath. Then in the blue box, we can see the delivery outcome and the depth of content that has to be covered. When we look closely, it states learners should be able to plan for installing drainage by the following information and guidance given to them by using the relevant documentation, and then we can see the documentation they have to be aware of. The range and depth of content will have to be covered. And it is worth noting at this point that the criteria and range to cover is extracted from the occupational competency statements that have been set by industry. And this is to enable a smooth transition when the learner is successful in gaining employment. So let's now take a closer look at the assessment. The progression qualification is assessed using 3 assessment methods, which is very similar to the foundation qualification. The on-screen assessment is externally set and internally marked with an overall weighting of 20%. The practical project, covering one trade pathway, is externally set, internally marked with a weighting of 60%. And then finally, the third one, which is the guided discussion, is externally set, internally marked, and has a weighting of 20%. As many learners prefer hands-on experience, this weighting of assessments will identify and reward demonstrated skills within the practical project. and we will be going through each method of assessment in the up and coming slides. But before we move on, I would like to reinforce that by week commencing the 10th of May, we will have an assessment pack, the qualification handbook, and other guidelines detailing the requirements of the assessments, which can be downloaded from the Skills for Wales website, and that is week commencing the 10th of May. Now we're going to cover the 3 methods of assessment, and you will see there's a 4th one at the bottom. The on-screen assessments are multiple choice questions, and they will be covering the 3 core units. It is 70 minutes long and contains 45 questions. And it is recommended that this is taken prior to the practical and guided discussion taking place. The practical project, which we'll see soon, is made up of 3 tasks that require the learner to plan, perform, and evaluate. This has to be taken before the guided discussion. The guided discussion contains 2 parts, including the learner's reflection on the practical project, and this method of assessment is externally set, internally marked, and externally verified. The guided discussion can only take place once the learner has completed the practical project. And the 3 assessments are graded from pass to distinction, with an overall and final grade being awarded once all sections are complete. And it is worth noting at this point that the learner must achieve a minimum of a pass in all the 3 methods of assessment. The 4th and final one is the health and safety assessment, which is not part of the qualification and is not mandatory. It is, however, to allow the learner to move forward in readiness to carry out the CSCS health and safety test to gain a CSCS card. This can be taken at any stage of the assessment process and may have already been completed while working towards the foundation qualification. The content within the qualification covers all aspects of learning required, which means no additional learning is required. And the test would be the Health and Safety Award, which is qualification 6072, which then allows them to move forward to complete the health and safety test set by the CSCS department. Here we can see examples of a selection of the questions from the on-screen test. Some are straight multiple choice, some are drag and drop, and others are pictures asking the learner to identify. This will be similar to what we do currently on many assessments, with the addition of a variety of question types. And the test can be taken any stage of the assessment process, although it is recommended that it is completed prior to the practical project and guided discussion. The practical project is a new approach to assessment, but it uses many similar approaches we have used in different previous assessments, particularly when we consider design type assessments and practicals with supporting evidence such as materials lists. So whilst it's a new title, the approach will be familiar. The project is externally set, internally marked, and externally quality assured. The project has 3 elements. Element 1 is the planning, element 2 is the performing, and element 3 the evaluating. And the learner will have 14 hours allocated for the planning of all 3 tasks. 40 hours will be allocated to carry out the 3 tasks. And the third element, which is the evaluate, is 6 hours to complete the 3 tasks. The learner will not be able to use the time they have been given for each element for another element. For example, if they complete their planning, which is allocated 14 hours, in 12 hours, they may not use the other 2 hours for either the performing or the evaluating elements. The learner will be required to devise plans for all 3 tasks, showing the approach they will take to undertake the work required in the tasks, underpinned by an overall schedule of works. Once the task has been completed, they will be required to evaluate their work. They must adhere to all relevant health and safety rules and procedures at all times. The planning task will be undertaken in a classroom environment where they will have access to IT equipment and appropriate resources to carry out their research. These materials may include guidance notes, regulations, and manufacturer's instructions/literature. Questions they should ask themselves, for example, is what does a good build installation look like in my trade area, and how can I achieve this? That should then be able to set the scene for them to move forward with this project. Requirements for the performing element can be found in section 3 of the Practical Project Guide, which contains project briefs for each trade. If the learner again completes in less time, they cannot use the extra time in the other elements of this project or take time from other elements to add time here. Once the learners have completed the performing element of the project, they must produce one evaluation report which reflects on the whole project and includes all tasks. This will be undertaken in a classroom environment under supervision from centre staff, ensuring learners have access to their planning documentation to support their review and evaluation activity. Excuse me. With regards to the marking of the planning, performing, and evaluating, there is a marking grid located within the assessment pack to be used for each element. We will be taking a deeper dive into the marking grid in future dedicated sessions, so please look out for future webinars and possibly face-to-face sessions should restrictions reduce in future. Here we can see an example of the practical project that provides an assessment brief. This is to try and make the assessment as realistic as we possibly can and prepare the learner accordingly. The assessment is made up of 3 tasks. It's got to total no more than 40 hours. Task 1, as you can see, the specification is to set out and install linear drainage and a drainage system for driveway. And 20 hours are allocated. The 20 hours allocated are a guide for the learner to use. Task 2, the specification, connection to drain and install new inspection chamber, and 6 hours are allocated. Task 3, lay brickwork and lay gully grate to a road storm gully, and 14 hours are allocated for this activity. Each task has set measurements that the learner will have to work towards. These sample assessments will be available from the Skills for Wales website by week commencing the 10th of May, as we have to have all documentation in English and the Welsh language before we can upload to the website. We will be sending out email alerts to confirm when they have been uploaded, so please ensure you are signed up to receive email alerts if you haven't already done so. Continuing from the previous slide, which referred to the 3 tasks the learner would have to complete, you can see on the left of the screen the materials list and tools and equipment that will be required. There will be an overview materials list for the centres to help plan and prepare. But this, along with the tools and equipment list, isn't to be shared with the learner, as they will make their own as part of their planning activity. The right-hand side of the slide shows the marking grid. This grid helps us to grade the learner, as we use the grid to apply marks, such as the plus or a minus between 15 to 5 millimeters would receive marks between 1 to 3, depending on the tolerances they have worked within for each part of the activity for that task. This is an approach used in some previous qualifications, so should be familiar to tutors, but if not, it's a fairly straightforward method and a similar approach used on the Wales skills competitions. The guided discussion is in 2 parts, but it's got to be completed in 1 time session. It's internally marked and externally verified, carried out in 40 minutes. With an extra 5 minutes can be allocated to complete their final question. This will explore the learner knowledge within their chosen pathway. It will also explore their knowledge and understanding of self-employed in their chosen pathway. It is recommended that a gap of no more than 3 weeks is left between the learner's finalisation of their project and completion of the guided discussion. Moving forward, we will be taking a deeper dive into the guided discussions as an assessment method in future dedicated sessions. So please look out for future webinars and possibly face-to-face sessions should restrictions reduce in future. To complete this section of the presentation, here is an overview of the assessments we have briefly covered for the progression qualifications. Learners will receive provisional grades for the assessments within 1 week of completion. Qualifications will undergo internal and external quality assurance, and the final grading will be issued by City and Guilds. It's worth noting the slight change in procedure to current qualifications. This is to enable us to quality assure and calculate the grading based on results across all the 3 assessments. If a learner fails to successfully achieve a pass grade in any of the assessments, they are permitted to resit or resubmit. And there are no limits to the number of reassessments. However, time may become an issue as learners will require further training and reinforcement prior to further attempts. I would now like to pass you back to David, who will take you through the next items on the agenda. Thank you for now.
Thank you very much, Ian. Now we'd like to take a look at the resources section. You may have seen some of this supporting information in previous webinars, but I'll quickly cover some of this again as a recap, and for those who may not have seen it before. Firstly, to help with initial setup, our resource document gives an overview of requirements to deliver and offer qualifications. Please access this document in your planning meetings to help answer those questions on resources and staffing. We also have a prospectus, which will help centres create their own promotional literature and help provide information for learners, parents and employers. Excuse me. So on the next slide, we can see an exemplar of our adaptable delivery planner. We do have a blank version, as it's likely that each centre will consider delivery differently, such as the duration you run each unit and when you build in your practicals. The planner has a role for you to input your unit and then the weeks to tick off as you work through the content of each unit. To support your CPD, we will be releasing a quarterly newsletter with links to various opportunities to engage with learning experiences. These may be links to dedicated videos or new manufacturers' news, etc. We're also creating a resource section on the Skills for Wales website to collect learning resources from third parties such as providers and centres. We will also link to relevant courses from trade and industry bodies such as CITB, CIPHE, NFB, and any associated e-learning. This slide shows some of the dates you can expect to see the materials become available, such as new tutor resources, which will start to become available from April, and May, with more becoming available in subsequent months. We're delivering assessment guidance will be available September 21. We have a completely new suite of tutor resources, as you can see on this slide. These have been offered for review by your peers and include typical support materials such as presentations, question papers, worksheets, and so on. In addition, we also have a dedicated foundation textbook by Hodder Education to support with delivering and learning across the foundation 6 core units. There is a sample chapter which can be accessed through the link on this slide. But in addition, and bearing in mind we're looking at the progression today, Hodder are creating free mapping documents into their current trade specific textbooks, so they can be used with the new suite of qualifications. Let's move on and have a look at our next steps. Here we can see several key dates. A couple I would like to highlight are the overview of teaching and learning webinars, which we're planning for May 21. And we hope to follow up with sessions, hopefully face-to-face, in the next academic year. And the go live and first teaching is September 21, so not too far away now. Moving on to the transition requirements, which have been discussed before, and Qualification Wales have run webinars on these, which are available to view. But let's have a brief recap. A learner completing a broad level 1 qualification this year, it's suggested, could progress on to the foundation. Someone completing a trade specific level 1 may progress to the foundation or progression. This would depend on the suitability of the learner to go into the progression at that stage. A learner completing level 2 trade specific this year may progress to the progression or the level 3 trade specific. There are also other options, and we suggest you consider this diagram when considering suitable destinations for learners. This slide then shows the journey for learners starting in 2022, showing a broad level 1 and foundation as suitable starting points and the new apprenticeship for learners who are employed. On this slide, we have a link to all current and future webinars. So we're working through these at the moment, but please take a look at this selection of webinars and register for any that you feel may be suitable. It's always worthwhile registering for the webinar, even if you're not sure if you can make it live, because the system will send you an automatic link to the recording of the webinar, usually within 24 hours. So that covers all the main content for this presentation. There are just a couple of more slides to go, but just before then, we'll double back and check if there are any further questions in the tab. Whilst you're thinking and considering those questions, just may I take this opportunity to thank Anne Harrod for opening up this webinar, Ian Roberts for delivering the main presentation, and again Ian for pulling together all the content required to deliver this presentation. So what I'll do now, we'll just pause for a moment to see if there are any questions. There's one that's come up previously in a few times, just around a little bit of the history around the 3 core units across the suite of progression qualification. Could you just give us a brief insight into that, please, Ian?
Yes, I can, and thank you, and welcome, like we said earlier, ladies and gentlemen. Yeah, there is 3 core units. The reason these core units were developed and proposed has actually come from the initial review that was carried out and the final report that came out in 2018. And this review, as we all know now, involved industry, various stakeholders, employers, and other people besides. And when it was identified, and especially for Unit 201, and that's why it's got the title, Employment and Employability in the Construction Sector, is to ensure that learners get a more in-depth coverage of exactly what opportunities are within the construction industry. And this is something that people believed that's been lacking previously. So that's something now that we can actually move forward with. And then when we start looking at Unit 202, which is changing practices over time, a lot of the buildings in Wales especially are pre-1919. And what they've been finding is that maintaining these types of buildings and working with them can also be detrimental if we don't maintain them and use the correct materials in the right way. So they brought that in to ensure that people learners especially, get a good knowledge and understanding of what they mean by pre-1919 buildings, but not only that, futuristic buildings as well. For example, we've already mentioned off-site manufacturing, prefabricated buildings, but not prefabricated as we've known it, is to make sure that they become more sustainability as we'll be able to move forward in that particular area. And then finally to the 3rd unit, 203, which is planning and evaluating work in the construction sector. But what's crucial is the construction sector in Wales, to ensure that we cover the traditional skills that's out there, the traditional buildings, as well as the pre-1919 buildings. But it's also about evaluating their own work as well. So a learner ensures that the quality provision is there as well as. And when we start talking about quality, it's not just quality of their workmanship, it's about the quality of how you maintain buildings, how you work closely with them to make sure that's more methodical. Because we all understand if you don't maintain the building correctly, and some people believe that they are maintaining buildings correctly, but if they're not using the correct materials, then it can have the adverse effect to what we have got to move forward. So it's about ensuring that the learner as well, if they do decide, not just about the progress within construction, what other opportunities are there, that opportunities about becoming self-employed as well, to be able to understand that. And if it does happen and they do want to go down that avenue, that they can become employers themselves, if that's deemed appropriate. And that's why them are the 3 core units. And the way they are assessed is within the knowledge test, as we understand. And there'll be multiple choice questions moving forward. Thank you, David. I hope that answers the question.
Yes, thank you very much for that insight, Ian. Well, there's no further questions, so could we move on to the final 2 slides, please, Ian? This is just a call out really for your feedback and to say it's very, very important to us. This development, we've worked closely with providers. So we've been running initially face-to-face sessions and more recently webinars, keeping providers up to date along with employers on the developments. And the feedback at those sessions have been very, very valuable. So you will receive an evaluation following this. We'd really appreciate if you could just take a few moments to respond to that, type in anything that you think that you like as part of this development, any concerns, any queries, any insight into the format of the support that you receive, the webinars work, you're looking forward to getting back to face-to-face, what type of sessions would you like? Would you prefer it face-to-face in groups at your centres? If you can share any of those sorts, please, it'd be really, really helpful. Thank you. So moving on to the final slide, it will show an email address we've been promoting. It's the skillsforwales.customer@sittinghills.com. Any queries you have at all, you can use that email address. Now, myself and Ian are always available to provide support and try and answer some queries. But the advantage of that email address, it will be centrally logged, so we'll have a record of the query, and it may be that it's a query for quality or another department. So it may be that it can go direct to the person who's best placed to answer it. So again, please make a note of that email address. So what I'll do now is I'll just drop back and check there are no further questions. We won't make everyone stay on the session any longer than they need to. If the questions have all been answered and the update has given you the information you need for now, we can close the webinar early. But we do want to make sure that everyone has the opportunity to have their questions answered or their views or just share their thoughts. So please do let us know if there are any further questions. But none have popped up here, so I think we can probably close a little bit early. So once again, just a big thank you to everyone for attending. We know how busy it is at your centre at this moment in time. Lots of pressures in education. We understand that, and it's good that you've taken the time to come and listen to us. We hope that you found it valuable, and we really do look forward to working with you closely in future. So a big thank you from me.
Thank you. Thank you from me. Thank you.
Have a nice afternoon and speak soon. Goodbye.